This video is going to be less visually based and more based on ideas, on words. This is probably the type of video you could just switch off the visuals and just listen to as a radio program if you wanted to. It's a follow-up to my last video that was all about how the Getty Villa managed to avoid burning down in the recent LA fires. I went over 3 important things they did that helped them avoid burning down, but I left out 2 important factors that I wasn't aware of at the time, but learned as I was doing more research. I'm going to tell you what those 2 extra things were, and then I'm going to take a big step back and look at some socio-political, environmental implications of all of these. But first, let's just go over those 3 things that I talked about in the last video. Those 3 things are 1, using fire-resistant building materials, 2, keeping the museum grounds clear of low, dry brush, and 3, dousing everything in water with extensive irrigation systems as soon as the red flag warnings popped up that there was going to be a fire. However, as I did more research, I found out that there were 2 other factors that were at least as important as these prior 3 factors. And these 2 factors were that 15 people, it appears from what I read in the Los Angeles Times article, 15 people stayed on the Getty Villa grounds throughout the duration of the fire. And there was a targeted airplane water drop that kind of doused the area approaching the Getty Villa before the fires reached there, which provided extra fire resistance. So these 2 additional factors are interesting because these are not things that just anybody could do. You know, like these aren't things that just any homeowner could do to protect their property. You can't just get, 15 people to stay on your property and put out little hotspots that are popping up, and you can't just hire an airplane to come and douse the area between the fire's path and your house. You're not going to have that ability as an individual homeowner. And when I think about all these 5 factors all together, there's some interesting social and political issues that they bring up. So I want to talk about some of these issues, and I also want to revisit the question of what can Californians do in general, both on the larger collective scales, but also as individuals, to protect ourselves and our environment from fires moving forward. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through this Los Angeles Times article where I got these 2 other factors that are very important to consider. After we go through the article, we're going to consider some of the socio-political issues that I mentioned. And here we'll pause and touch on some of the socialist versus capitalist types of attitudes that have flavored different takes on the Palisades fires and what the people who live there have gone through. But after that, we're going to shift towards thinking about the Californian environment kind of on a larger scale, the different types of nature that exist in California, the different types of fire danger posed by these different types of habitat. And using the insights that we've kind of gained by looking at how the Getty Villa managed these fires, both on the things that could be done by personal individuals and the things that require larger societal infrastructure, we're going to consider some of the ways that environmental concerns are balanced against concerns for urban and suburban spaces for people's homes, and we'll try to work out some of the implications of these tensions. So this is an article from the Los Angeles Times called "Inside the Dash to Save the Getty Villa from the Palisades Fire: A Timeline." And it's by Jessica Gelt and was published on January 9th. After a few paragraphs into the article, we find out that 16 members of the Getty Villa's emergency team stayed there through the duration of the fire. Now, that's huge. If you have a team of 16 people on the property, they can do a lot, especially if they are well trained. That's a huge factor, and I definitely should have included it in my previous video, and I would have included it if I had known for sure that they stayed for the duration, because in the previous video, I was going off of a podcast that Catherine E. Fleming had gave, and she had mentioned that there were staff members who stayed, but she didn't really specify whether they stayed for the entire time or not. So it wasn't until this article in the LA Times that I confirmed that, yes, they did stay for the duration of the fire. Now, again, I don't know the legality of that. And I am in no way critical of the fact that they did. I'm grateful that they stayed there. And, maybe they risked their lives. Maybe they didn't. Maybe the Getty Villa has such good facilities. They have bunkers to hide in. Who knows? I'm sure they do. They have such good facilities that the people's lives were not really in risk. And maybe there's special carve-outs in the law that, allow for institutions like this to maintain their expert kind of disaster employees on site, even when evacuation orders are given. I really don't know. In fact, I don't even know if residents are required to comply with evacuation orders or not. I don't know the legality of that. If any of you do, go ahead and put it in the comments below. I'd love to know more about that. The article goes on to emphasize some of the things that I spoke about in that previous video, the fact that the museum had already pruned the landscaping, anything that might catch fire, and that tree canopies were high off the ground. They do have lots of beautiful trees there, but supposedly the canopies of those trees are high off the ground. Low-lying brush had been significantly thinned. And then they also talk about the fact that the grounds were irrigated. Now, I just feel like some of the wording in this is sort of misleading. When you just hear that the grounds were irrigated, the picture that comes to your mind isn't necessarily like that everything is doused in water, but I'm fairly certain that that must be the case. That, I don't think that we're talking about just sprinklers on the grass. I think it's like sprinklers on everything. So I think the wording, later when we get into sort of the environmental factors and stuff, we can talk about why maybe they're being sensitive about the wording for these things. But also, another thing to think about here is the fact that the Getty Villa has dense vegetation. It has really, really beautiful landscaping, and it's not by any means, it's not like, very thin and sparse. So I think that either the ground covers and the sort of low-lying vegetation they use is of a sort that's not very fire-prone, or maybe more of this stuff burned than they're kind of letting on. I think it's an interesting question. And again, I 100% believe that clearing away the low-lying brush, especially the dry sort of brush that pops up naturally in California, not necessarily the stuff that's maintained in gardens, clearing away that kind of stuff is, of paramount importance in preventing the fire. But I am in this video sort of wanting to explore some of these other things that were perhaps even larger contributing factors, such as the fact that 16 people stayed on the grounds of the museum throughout the course of the fire. And then the other big thing, remember, was that there was a airdrop. So let's go ahead and read this. So about 20 minutes later, security swept the grounds to make sure only emergency staff was on site. Heat from the fire caused several cameras to fail to reboot. 10 minutes later, an aerial fire crew dropped water over the villa's ranch house, which Fleming said is at the perimeter of the property and most vulnerable to the fire. The ranch house was J. Paul Getty's original residence and was not built with the same fire-resistant construction as the villa. Again, that is huge. That's a huge thing that was probably a key factor in mitigating the amount of damage that was done by the fire. I can't really speak to it that much. I always had assumed that just things merely being wet wouldn't stop a fire like this, because you tend to think that the heat caused by the fire would evaporate the water very quickly and cause everything to wither and dry out, and it sort of feeds itself because it dries out what it's coming up to before it gets to it, and then it can catch it on fire more easily. However, the more I hear about the different types of structures that did survive, the more that this, things being doused in water does seem to be a big factor. And therefore, it seems like the aerial drop of water on the perimeter of the museum was probably a huge contributing factor. Again, not something that, an individual can call in for. And again, not something that I am, in any way, shape, or form, jealous of, or I'm so happy that they were able to do that. I'm so happy that, the county prioritized protecting this collection. Going back to the infrastructure and the fact that they had those 16 employees on site, they had a camera system that is where they can see pretty much everything in the entire museum grounds. So they had in the center location, the location that was not threatened by the fire, they kind of had the command and control center where they could see all of these things. They were talking in real time, relaying messages back to the villa. So if anybody spotted anything happening, they could send someone out to take care of whatever problem that was. Again, just like it's amazing. It's awesome that they have that capability. Not something that, an individual property owner is going to be able to do. The closest the flames got, and sort of the scariest moment for the villa, was when the flames came up to the perimeter wall behind the restaurant. And I'll try to get a photo. I'll try to get a photo that can show you what that looks like. There is a lot of pretty dense foliage there, but after that, the bushes near the classical theater caught on fire, and Fleming says this was her biggest moment of panic, because you could see the rosemary just go up in a big flash of fire, but it also burned itself out really quick. And they say that those flames died on their own. Again, I don't really know. Did they really, or did some people go out and try to put them out at least after they died down? Maybe. But because there is at least one mention in this article where they talk about people going out to use extinguishers to put out a fire. So let's see. At 3:59 p.m., fire erupted at the museum's pedestrian gate. Getty security put out the blaze with fire extinguishers in just 6 minutes. Again, speaking to the power of having those people there on site. Now here, I want to take a moment and tell you guys a personal story. There's been, I think, at least 2 times in my life when my parents' home, which is in a sort of a rural spot in Southern California. Believe it or not, there are many rural places in Southern California still left. And my parents' home has been threatened numerous times. And 2 of those times that I can remember, my father decided to stay behind after the evacuation orders in order to put out hotspots and try to protect the house. I think in both cases, I don't think I know. In both cases, the fire never got so close that he even needed to put anything out. But in both cases, I was just irate with him for staying. I was so mad. I thought, how could you be taking such a huge risk just for, material possessions? And, you're like, we can't replace you, but, we could always get another house. I mean, I don't know if that's even true anymore in California. Things are getting desperate in terms of how hard it is to buy homes here. But the idea, just like, you have to prioritize human life above possessions. And, now when I look back and I think about it more, I kind of admire my father's bravery in staying to protect his home. I still sort of feel like it's, probably not worth it in the majority of cases. The risk is just so great. And yet, I do get it. I can understand it. I think what we want to do is we want to create a situation where homes can be saved by people taking small amounts of risk, not huge risks, in the most intelligent way possible. And I don't know what that looks like, but definitely it seems like more could be done. Maybe we could have community members receive training that would help them get through situations like this. I guess what I'm trying to say is I kind of appreciate that libertarian impulse to just sort of like defy the government, to stay behind and fight for what's yours, while at the same time I understand the impetus of the government to try to protect the populace from taking irrational and crazy risks that put itself in danger. At the end of the day, I do think it's best to let people decide for themselves what they want to do, what level of risk is acceptable to them. But these two concerns do need to be balanced in some way. So that's one of the socio-political implications that I mentioned. This sort of balance between the libertarian impulse to kind of defy the government, to defy evacuation orders, to fight for what's yours, versus the imperative to protect the population, to protect and prevent some kind of mass casualty event, which you can easily imagine is definitely a big possibility if you've got a large amount of people who are like, no, I'm gonna, go against these evacuation orders. Now, the second socio-political implication of all of this has to do more with the capitalist versus socialist dimension, and there are kind of two things that this story brings up along those lines. First, let me take a big step back and say that I think a lot of people have been aware that there is a conversation out there revolving around how much sympathy the people in the Palisades deserve. And there's a lot of people on the lower levels of the economic ladder who are kind of irritated at the outpouring of sympathy for people that they perceive as privileged, as wealthy. And there's just kind of a general distaste or disdain for people who are property owners who have wealth. And it's understandable in so far as that many Americans are suffering, are poor, and things have become much more difficult in terms of saving money, building wealth, buying houses, owning property. This kind of American dream has become out of reach for a lot of people. So the sense of jealousy is understandable. And yet, if it really is just jealousy, of course, that is not a worthwhile motive to act on. But that's where sort of the Marxist critique comes into play, and you could either view the Marxist critique as a sort of a justification for what's really just jealousy. And my own personal view is somewhere kind of in the middle. I do think that there are some valid Marxist critiques that capitalists ought to take into consideration, but I also think that capitalism has a lot of functionality that Marxists would ignore to their peril. I think both sides ignore the valid points of the opposite side to their own peril. But let me go ahead and substantiate some of these claims by reading to you from an article that I believe was written with this sort of anti-capitalist, kind of a little irritated at wealth and the wealthy perspective. This article comes from The Independent. I don't really know much about this publication. It looks like it's based in the UK but has an American branch. I'm assuming it's kind of left-wing aligned. The article that I'm reading from is by Zoe Beatty, I guess. Not sure how you pronounce that last name. And the title is How the Getty Museum Survived LA Wildfires as the Super Rich Take Note. Kind of interesting. You can kind of hear the disdain for wealth right there from the get-go. Subtitle is, As the fires rampaged through the 5 different suburbs of LA, they didn't discriminate in who was affected, but then those with means started doing things differently. And so you can kind of see here that she's not really outright like saying rich people are bad, or, poor people are always the victims and the rich are, really she's not like pouring derision explicitly on the wealthy, but there's like an undertone that you can kind of hear where she's kind of irritated. And here, I'll read another passage where that kind of comes out a little more. One resident, Greg Benton, told Associated Press reporters that he was searching the remains of his Pacific Palisades home of 31 years in the hope of finding his great-grandmother's wedding ring. It's those small family heirlooms that hurt the most, he said. It's this, the clarity of what is valuable and to whom, that has gradually become the undertone the fire has left behind. Natural disasters are indiscriminate, experts continued to warn throughout this week. The climate crisis cannot be bribed, and wealth cannot always protect against it. Yet, as we saw this week, even amid the devastation, money, and who has it, still determines what worldly goods are protected. As Hollywood's elite began announcing their losses via social media last week, the eat the rich sentiments of Gen Z and millennials crescendoed. Am I supposed to care about the rich whose homes were burnt to a crisp? Because I don't, one user posted on X, Twitter. Among many similar sentiments. Elsewhere, headlines such as, Shame on the abhorrent A-listers who have just done the most egregious thing imaginable amid the LA fires. But is anyone shocked? Further stoked the flames. And let's skip a couple of paragraphs here. On Sunday, the so-called class war ignited by the fires became even more visible as reports emerged of wealthy families hiring private firefighters to protect their homes while neighboring buildings burned, sparking widespread criticism. Does anyone have access to private firefighters? One Palisades resident wrote on X, will pay any amount. The backlash was so intense that the author was forced to deactivate their account. It neatly illustrated the issue, the privilege of affording protection and safety when others cannot. In Los Angeles, a city of extreme socioeconomic disparity, where more than 50 billionaires reside and 16.5% of the population lives in poverty, the ability to rebuild raises serious concerns. Questions have already been raised about who has the financial means to engage lawyers, to advocate with insurance firms facing hefty payouts, to move away, or to fund expensive shelters. Those without such options remain the lesser-seen victims of the disaster. Insecurity is not experienced equally. Meanwhile, the wealth disparity in contributions to climate change looms uncomfortably in the background. The richest 1% of humanity is more responsible for the climate emergency than the poorest 66%, who ironically suffer the most from its consequences, a 2023 report found. Now, I'm not going to speak to this report. I haven't read it, don't know what's in it. It's an interesting claim to make. I would suggest taking it with a grain of salt. For instance, if we look at poor countries versus wealthy countries, rather than poor individuals versus wealthy individuals, I think it is pretty provable that poorer countries contribute far more to climate change than the wealthy countries currently. And that's not to say that climate change is not an important factor to tackle in this issue. I think it is, but I also don't think it's the only factor to look at and to deal with. But let's get back to this article. I'm going to read you the final 2 paragraphs, and I think it's interesting because as I was reading them, I thought, okay, I don't really disagree with anything she wrote here, and yet I felt like a lot of her statements were out of place in an article that was purportedly devoted to looking at how the Getty Villa survived the fires. And what I think that says is that she's using this as an opportunity to kind of step up on a soapbox and say a bunch of other things that aren't really directly related to the story, that she wants, more general statements that she wants to make just about wealth inequality. Okay, so here are the final 2 paragraphs. As the fire continues to devastate LA and as residents come to terms with their losses and an uncertain future, our collective empathy for those affected is crucial. Perhaps as LA begins to assess the damage, it's time to reflect on what we truly value. In the case of the Getty, foresight and funding protected its treasures. In the future, as more disasters driven by the climate change emergency inevitably occur, those searching through the rubble for their histories deserve more protection too. As LA considers its next steps, better governance, equitable aid, access to insurance and protection, and prioritizing the planet would be a good place to start. Okay, so I mean, maybe you see what I mean. She's like making really broad statements that aren't really about how the Getty managed to preserve itself through these fires, which, is kind of, I don't know, what was the title again? Maybe it's included in the title. Let's see. How the Getty Museum Survived the LA Wildfires as the Super Rich Take Note. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe that little bit of kind of socialist attitude is already woven into the very title. So maybe it is relevant, I suppose, to what she set out to do. I guess just for me, I don't like it because I prefer a really in-depth look at how the Getty survived the fires, and then we can step back and see what the broader society can do to implement some of these strategies, rather than just using it as a soapbox moment to make a bunch of broad statements about what we should or shouldn't be concerned about and what we should or shouldn't value. I mean, I think, again, it's pretty easy to see why the broader public would value their museum. This is like, in some sense, this is our museum. This is one of Southern California's greatest museums. I want to point out what I see as a big irony. The arts are dominated today by the left. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I don't think anybody who was an out-of-the-closet conservative would be allowed anywhere near the levers of power in any institution pertaining to arts and culture in today's society. Now, the term "the left" is a very broad term, and you can definitely be a capitalist who is left-wing. And there are many shades of left-wing, going from that person who's a left-wing capitalist all the way into, deep red, and we're talking about the old-fashioned red, right? Communist territory. So anywhere in between, you could be a democratic socialist, you could be a full-on tanky. And pretty much all that really unites all of those people is their own desire not to be labeled as conservative. So I'm not saying that everybody involved in museums and these high-level artistic institutions is an outright communist or even just a democratic socialist. I'm just saying that broadly speaking, they tend to be on the left, and I would be very surprised to learn of anyone who was an avowed conservative being in any high position within any mainstream artistic institution. Now, I have no idea what J. Paul Getty's own personal political leanings were, but he was a fabulously wealthy oil tycoon, so I think it's probably safe to say that he was a capitalist. I guess the big irony that I'm seeing is that people who are affiliated with the Getty nowadays are probably more likely to feel like they need to disavow a person like J. Paul Getty than they would be to disavow the extreme radical voices on the left. Even though some of those voices are going to be so extreme and so radical that they would call for the destruction of something like the Getty Villa. I mean, I haven't seen any leftists calling for the destruction of the Getty Villa. Okay, let's just be 100% clear about that. I'm not saying that that's a big common thing out there. I think most people on the left love art and they're appreciative of the fact that they can go to a place like the Getty Villa and experience it. But I do think that there are some people who would see the Getty Villa as a symbol of capitalist wealth and opulence and therefore something bad. I guess what I'm trying to say is that people who are in control of museum collections ought to have a little bit of conservative leanings. I'm not saying they need to be on the right, but at least have some conservative leanings, because to conserve and preserve is part of the mission of a museum. And I don't think they should be shy about that either. Museums are amazing things and they serve a social function. In some sense, they have a socialist spirit in the sense that you're opening up this place for society, for ordinary people to come and experience beauty. But there's always going to be some portion of the population for whom it's just never enough. Things can never be fair enough. Let's go back to the example of using planes to, dump huge volumes of water on the museum perimeter in order to protect it. Like, there's only so many planes to go around. And if we're going to cry and whine as individual property owners that, they didn't prioritize this property or that property, when they have to make strategic choices because they don't have limitless resources, I really don't see how anyone in their right mind could get mad at the city working with the J. Paul Getty Trust to ensure the protection of that museum. But I'm sure those people are out there. So anyway, these are just some interesting issues that I think the fire brings up, the preservation of the Getty Villa brings up. Interesting issues that we're going to have to navigate as a society. Now, I did say I was going to talk about some of the different ecological zones, some of the different types of natural habitat in California and why they are so fire prone. And I wanted to discuss some different strategies that we can do in order to coexist with these types of habitat, and also discuss the trade-offs in terms of environmental protection and concerns versus the concerns for people, for suburban places and suburban populations, rural populations, and even, as we've seen, urban populations. But you know what? That's just too big. It's too big of a scope. I'm going to have to save that for another video. I promise that will be my last video about California wildfires, because obviously this is supposed to be a channel that is focused on art, and I'm trying real hard to stay focused here, even though my mind is the type of mind that likes to go all over to many different topics, and I got a lot of passion for a lot of different subjects. This one was just too big to contain, so I had a lot of spillover into these other topics that I love dearly. Hopefully, we get back on track on this channel and just talk about art. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. It helps me out a ton, and I really appreciate it if you do. My channel is not monetized, but I do have a book you can buy, and it's called Thoughts. If you want to find it, just look up Brian D.K. Thoughts on Amazon, but make sure you have books selected when you search Brian D.K. Thoughts, otherwise it won't show up. It has around 150 illustrations. It took me about 10 years to make it, and it really is just a collection of random thoughts, thoughts on many different subjects ranging from mortality, romance, quasi-philosophical issues. It's full of my art, so if you're interested in seeing my own drawings, then there's many, many examples in this book. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and ciao for now.